Welcome to the Burnett Breakdown, where I, Hunter Burnett, keep up with the news so that you don't have to. This week, I'm going to be talking about the jobs report, Biden healthcare restrictions, and Chinese export controls. On Friday, the June jobs report was released. The jobs report showed that hiring slowed in June, but wages rose and unemployment fell. The U.S. employers added 209,000 workers in the month of June, a solid monthly gain, but it was down from May's revised 306,000 jobs gained. Employment has grown every month for 2.5 years, but June's gain was the smallest during the last 2.5 years. Essentially, this jobs report is expected to keep the Fed on track to raise rates later this month. If you remember, I talked about the Fed pausing rate hikes last month as a wait-and-see approach to the economy and how the interest rate hikes that they were doing impacted the economy. But they made clear that they intended to continue to raise rates in the future, and most economists see this jobs report as not changing that. That the Fed is expected to continue to raise rates next month. The economy expanded and has been expanding at a 2% annual rate in the first quarter this year, and is expected to grow at a similar rate for the second quarter of this year. So what you see is a inflation rate that is about 4% or so, depending on how it's being calculated. You have a 2% growth rate, and the Fed continued to raise rates. As I talked about last time, I don't think the Fed should continue to raise rates. I'm no economist, so take all this with a grain of salt. But interest rate hikes take a while to have an effect in the economy, and we're still seeing the impact of the interest rate hikes they've been doing. We have an economy that isn't booming by any stretch of the imagination. 2% is good, but it's not astronomical growth by any sort of measure. So we have an all right growth rate, an inflation rate that has only been going down for the last year or so since they began to raise rates. You have a banking industry that has already been experienced a ton of distress, as we saw with multiple bank collapses. We have production numbers that are not amazing, and this job market right now is drawing in younger workers. So the labor force participation rate for Americans ages 25 to 54 rose in June to the highest level since 2002. So we have a labor force participation rate amongst the predominant the economic driving cohort, and they have jobs. And I fail to see how people having jobs is bad for the economy, how people and wages growing is bad for the economy, like the Fed seems to say. Again, I think the way out of this inflation, again, that is already coming down, is to grow our way out of it. I do not think breaking the economy or putting us into a recession, which the Fed says they're not trying to do, but I don't know what else they're trying to do at this point other than just break something and then stop. But that I don't think is necessary. I don't want an economy driven by the Fed. I want the Fed to largely get out of the economy, to maintain a reasonable inflation rate, and not try to produce or go against economic forces, which I feel like they're trying to do right now. In other U.S. news, U.S. petroleum production is on pace for a record-breaking year. So, U.S. crude output this year through April is up 9% from a year ago. The increase is driven mainly by improved production efficiency. So what happened is, back when oil prices tanked in 2015-ish, oil companies, because they couldn't rely on high oil prices, they were essentially forced to improve their efficiency. They cut costs, but they made sure that their production was more efficient, and it had to be more efficient. And if it wasn't more efficient, then they were going to go out of business. So they improved their production lines, their production methods, and as a result, have become more efficient than ever before. They're producing more energy at lower costs and in more efficient ways than ever before. And what this has resulted in is what we see now, an oil boom. Levels of oil production in the United States that we haven't seen ever, record-breaking levels. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is kind of in the face of a country like Saudi Arabia that recently, Saudi Arabia and OPEC announced that they were going to cut oil production levels around the world. The attempt, or the reason why they're going to do that is obviously to increase the price of oil. The price of oil is at a reasonable rate, but it's not at the $80, $90, $100 a barrel that it was at one point. Saudi Arabia kind of wants oil to get back to that number. I read that $80 is essentially the break-even point for Saudi Arabia. That once oil barrels are worth $80, then Saudi Arabia is essentially breaking even. So they want that $80 number. So they cut production. They lead OPEC to cut production. But we haven't seen oil prices recover to that level. Oil prices still haven't gone up. Now, part of that is on the demand side. The Chinese demand has not swelled oil prices to the point that they were initially believed to. But the United States becoming a major oil producer is another one. Now, this is important to keep in mind as we hear, and we've already heard, Republican candidates that want to be Republican presidential candidates some of them have mentioned American independence, oil independence, as kind of a platform of theirs. It's important to keep in mind that the United States is, by almost any definition, energy independent. You have Saudi Arabia, you have OPEC wanting to raise the price of oil by cutting production, and it isn't working. And it's not working because the United States is producing so much oil. Now, I'm not saying that the Biden administration is an oil-friendly administration. By no stretch of the imagination is it. However, they also aren't necessarily restricting production like many Republicans would have you believe. That doesn't mean they're expanding it. That doesn't mean that they're oil-friendly. Again, by no stretch of the imagination are they. But the oil industry in the United States, in spite of the Biden administration, is still producing a lot of oil, which is good news and I think is a product of markets in action. Also this week, and what I want to focus a lot of time on, is this new Biden administration attempt to regulate or restrict short-term private health plans. So this is a little in the weeds, but I think it's important, and it shows it's a big criticism I have of this administration right now. The fear of the administration is that these short-term private health plans undermines the viability of the exchanges set up under the Obama-era Affordable Care Act. So let me kind of explain what that means. So the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, known now as Obamacare, set up these online exchanges. These online exchanges are basically websites that consumers can go on and they can purchase private insurance company plans. So if you go on, I think it's healthcare.gov, you can see all these different plans and they're rated they're tiered out. You've got bronze level, silver level, gold level, I think platinum level as well. And you can go on the website, you can see all these plans that private insurance companies have put on this exchange that you can purchase. But in order to be on these exchanges, the insurance companies and the plans that they put on these exchanges have to meet certain requirements. So, for example, they have to provide 10 essential health benefits. And just to name a few of those health benefits that these plans, if they want to be a part of these exchanges, what they have to do. They have to provide doctor service, inpatient and outpatient hospital care, prescription drug coverage, pregnancy and childbirth services, mental health services, just to name a few. They also have to follow certain federal limits on how much that you as the consumer are required to pay towards your health care costs. So essentially, these are caps. These are price caps on how much these companies can charge. So you have these exchanges. They have to provide certain essential, quote unquote, essential services, and they cannot charge more than a certain amount. That's kind of what these exchanges are. Again, these were put in place by the ACA, Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. So these short-term health, private health plans that the Biden administration is seeking to restrict, they don't go through these exchanges at all. They are sold by these private insurance companies directly to consumers, which means that they don't have to meet the regulations necessary to be sold on the ACA exchanges. They don't have to provide those 10 essential services that I mentioned. They aren't capped on their price. So these plans are attractive to some consumers, and they're attractive to some consumers for a variety of reasons. For example, they're generally less expensive than those plans on the exchanges. They offer flexible coverage periods, so you can get them for just 30 days. You can get them for up to 3 years, or any kind of where in between. They can also be obtained any time of the year, not just during the once-a-year open enrollment period for the ACA exchanges. Now, that seems good, right? Consumers are attracted to these because largely they're cheaper and they're more flexible than the ACA plans. However, and this is where the Biden administration hates them, well, this is one of the reasons the Biden administration hates them, these plans do not cover as much as those sold on the ACA exchanges, which makes sense, right? They're cheaper, but one of the reasons they can be cheaper is because they don't cover as much. It's just a simple, market economics. But the Biden administration doesn't like that. They don't like that people can choose to pay less and not be covered for as much. Now, again, like I mentioned, one of the reasons. There's another reason that they also don't want those short-term private plans to really exist, and that is because they attract younger, healthier people away from the ACA marketplaces. So think about the people, the cohort, the demographic of people who are attracted to a insurance plan that is cheaper premiums, but doesn't cover as much. And it's going to be younger, healthier people because they don't have a whole lot of medical costs right now. So, of course, they're attracted to these cheaper, more flexible plans that may not cover as much. So, the issue with that, according to the Biden administration, though, is that these young, healthy people are important to keep the premiums on the exchange insurance plans down. You see, if you only have older and less healthy people signing up for the insurance plans that are on the Obamacare exchanges, then the premiums, because of economics, have to go up because they're going to be using those plans more. They're going to be requiring more services because they're older, and by nature of being older, there's just more things that they have to take care of, more risk. And so the insurance companies, in order not to just lose a bunch of money, have to raise premiums. So the Biden administration and Democratic lawmakers, because this is being pushed by Democratic lawmakers, they recognize that if younger, healthier people do not sign up for the insurance plans that are on the exchanges, then that will make the premiums go up. So they want to get rid of these short-term private health insurance plans. So the proposed rule would limit the plans to 3 months or a max of 4 months if the consumers opt to extend them. Now, this idea, this regulation that is going to go in place unless is withdrawn, essentially, is a really bad idea. It's restricting consumer choice, okay? So let me just mention again what some of the benefits and why this is attractive to some consumers. It's flexible. It can fill in gaps in coverage. It lets consumers cancel coverage without penalties, provides a variety of kind of individualized plans, and allows consumers to pick deductible amounts. A lot of choice that the consumer has because of these private short-term healthcare plans. And the Biden administration would rather limit the amount of choice consumers have and force consumers onto the ACA. That's absurd to me. No one knows what I need better than me. No one knows better about what healthcare and health insurance needs that I may need than me. And that applies for every consumer. It turns out millions upon millions of people know what is best for themselves, more so than a centralized entity in form of the federal government. What this is the federal government invading into our lives and saying, we know what's best for you. You need all of these things covered. We know you need them. And even if you don't need them, it doesn't really matter because some people need them. So we're going to push you into the direction of getting into the ACA exchange insurance plans because we need those people to have those things covered because we know what's best for you. Now, this rule has been back and forth. In 2016, the Obama administration implemented a similar rule to this. That rule was then reversed in 2018 by the Trump administration, saying basically what I was just arguing, that consumers deserved more choice. And now the Biden administration is going back again. Now, whenever I see a rule or a regulation like this going back and forth between administrations, my immediate reaction is to scream, Congress. Okay, Congress needs to do something about this so that we don't have this back and forth. In other words, I think preferably Republicans, but shoot, if Democrats want to do it, doesn't look likely, but Republicans in Congress should pass a law allowing for these short-term private insurance plans to exist so that Democratic presidents can't just come in and immediately reverse any rule that Republican presidents get rid of. So I am all about choice. Choices lead to more innovation, leads to lower prices in the products and services that we consume. That applies for health insurance as well. The more choice that consumers have, the more it forces insurance companies to get creative, to innovate, and incentivizes competition, which leads to lower prices. Better care, better services at lower prices. That's what competition does in every economic sector, in every industry, in all realms of the economy. That's what free market economics do. It applies for health insurance as well. And what we have here is the Biden administration stepping in and saying we know best. I can't stand that. I can't stand when any administration does this. So the Biden administration needs to go back on this rule, and there needs to be a lot more outrage about this rule than there is. Now, moving on to international news. So China, on Monday, set export restrictions, basically caps, on 2 minerals that the U.S. says are critical to the production of semiconductors, missile systems, and solar cells. So the minerals, gallium and germanium, and more than 3 dozen other related metals and materials will be subject to export controls starting August 1st that have not yet been specified by China. So we don't actually know what these export controls and restrictions are going to look like exactly, but the Chinese government came out and announced that there will be some form of export restrictions or controls. The U.S., this doesn't really come out of nowhere because the U.S. in October halted exports to China of equipment used to produce more advanced semiconductors. They also, the U.S., pushed allies such as South Korea and the Netherlands to do the same. So there are certain equipment that is used to produce like the most advanced semiconductors in the world that the U.S. has banned its companies from exporting to China. Now, all of this is part of the larger trade war that has been going on between the U.S. and China since going back to the Trump administration. That the Biden administration has largely continued. There's been very little differences in terms of the Trump administration and Biden administration and how they view trade with China and free trade in general. There's been very little difference. So, this trade war has been going on where essentially you have the United States and China putting tariffs, controls, regulations on trade with each other. And we see this continuing with this export restriction. And so how impactful is this restriction going to be? Well, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, about 53% of U.S. gallium was imported from China between 2018 and 2021. So 53% of all imports of gallium to the U.S. from China between 2018 and 2021. However, there's an important caveat to that number, and that is that the share of gallium imported from the U.S. Or by the U.S. from China has drastically dropped because the U.S. imposed higher imports on Chinese gallium starting in 2019. Again, going back to the middle of a trade war between the two countries. Now, this is obviously significant if it does lead to a decrease in production of semiconductors, missile systems, and solar cells. I have my doubts that is going to be the case. I think that the economy and different industries are very flexible when you allow the market to work. And so if they can't get gallium from China, they will either find gallium from some other place, some other source, or they will develop semiconductors and these products to not use gallium. So I do think that the market is going to get creative in how it deals with these. But I think this is an important story to recognize that this tough on China, this trade war on China stance that is basically the only bipartisan agreement between the two parties right now, comes at a cost. You cannot raise tariffs, restrict exports without suffering economically. Now, we can argue about whether the suffering that comes is worth the implementation of the tariffs and export controls. There is an argument to be made that though it will cost us economically, it's worth it because these industries that we are seeking to protect are so important to our national security that we would be worse off than we already are with the economic consequences of these policies. We'd be worse off if we allowed these industries to basically move overseas. I do not buy the national security arguments for most of the tariffs that we have on China and other countries. I don't think that there's a national security concern that outweighs the economic concern because, I think markets are resilient, meaning if China really is an economic national security threat, markets will take that into consideration. And in fact, I think markets already are taking that into consideration. What you have is you already have supply chains moving from China to Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Taiwan, or not Taiwan, Thailand. You already have supply chains and companies moving their supply chains to these countries. Now, they still have a lot of their supply chain in China. And they're always going to have a lot unless China just decides to restrict it, or the United States decides to restrict it. But what they're doing is they are diversifying away from China because they're diversifying away from risk. The Chinese economy, as it centralizes, as it increases its power and its grip on the economy, which it has done under Xi Jinping, countries are disincentivized from investing in China because there's inherent risk involved. You get on the wrong side of the Chinese government, you no longer can operate in China. So if all of your supply chains are located in China, that means that you're done, right? And that was noticeable during COVID. And in fact, during COVID, the argument was made by so many people that, see, this is why we need to produce things in the United States. While we need to produce some more things in the United States, that's not really a concern. The concern is we just need to diversify our supply chains. And then companies realized that because of COVID and the zero COVID policies put in place by China and the centralization of the Chinese economy, realized that and said, deal. We're going to do it either way. You don't have to force us. We're going to do it because it's economically smart. So there is a cost to this trade war. There is an economic cost to this trade war that we see with China putting export restrictions on gallium and germanium. And the longer this trade war continues, both the United States and China are going to suffer economically, and the world is going to suffer economically. Again, that may be worth it, but it's just important to recognize that there is a cost to it. Finally, in niche news, you could say, the president of Senegal, the African country, President Macky Sall, said on Monday that he would not seek a third term in office. So this came after a month where at least 16 people died in government protests that were motivated in part by his refusal to say whether he would run for a third term or not. Senegal, it's in West Africa. It has a constitutional limit of 2 terms that a president can run. And because of the Senegal, Sall's refusal to acknowledge that he would not run for a third term, people were worried that this would essentially devolve into basically a dictatorship. Thousands of demonstrators, mostly young people, have been protesting what they viewed as an authoritarian drift from from Sall's government in Senegal. And that was kind of put to rest this week when Sall announced he would not run for a third term. This stands in stark contrast to other African countries in this region where leaders have continued leading in spite of constitutional restrictions. For example, the president of Ivory Coast was elected in 2021 for a third term despite a constitutional rule limiting presidents to 2-term. Also, the president of the Central African Republic is seeking a third term through a constitutional referendum scheduled this month. And Senegal is different from these countries in that it considers itself a model of democracy in Africa. It has never experienced a coup since gaining independence from France in 1960. And so this was Senegalese democracy reigning out. Now, I will admit that there is very little impact on the United States. The impact on the United States of this is minimal, but there is some benefit. So the Sahel region of Africa has been rife with terrorism for years now, and it's only growing and increasing. For example, countries just east of Senegal, such as Mali and Burkina Faso, have been fighting with Islamic terrorists, again, for years, the Burkina Faso in particular. And it's important that a country like Senegal that has a relatively strong democracy, one of the strongest in the regions, continues to have a strong democracy. Because the stronger of a democracy that countries have, the less likely it is that terrorist groups can expand into those countries, leaving that country better off. So Senegal is better off without having to fight Islamic terrorists, but also it leaves the United States safer in the long run because that limits the areas that the U.S. has to fight Islamic terrorists and the countries where Islamic terrorists are, give a safe space for terrorists to think up and to plot. What happened before 9/11 is that these terrorist groups in Afghanistan, like Al-Qaeda, had room and under the Taliban were able and had safety that they cooked up and plotted the 9/11 attack. What we want to limit is safe spaces for that to happen again. So Senegal having a flourishing democracy is good for Senegal itself, but also is good and leads the United States to be a safer country as a result. And with that, that is it for the podcast this week. Please like, subscribe, share, do whatever you can to make this podcast go far and wide. And I hope you tune in again next week.